Welcome to the Right Take Podcast, news, ideas, and conversations at the intersection of politics and culture, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I will be your host, Mark Tapson. Welcome again to the Right Take Podcast. I am your host, Mark Tapson. I hope you're having a glorious day and making the most of it. I'm honored that you've chosen to spend some time of that day with me here at the Right Take Podcast. You know, if you're a listener of mine or a reader of my writing, then it's probably pretty obvious to you that I'm a guy who loves books and reading. I'm sure many of you are the same way, maybe even most or all of you. But if so, you and I are in a diminishing minority. Young readers today are in danger of going extinct, thanks, of course, to all of the distractions of modern technology and of a pop culture that is completely focused on the now, the new, and the what's next. Young people today are more unlikely than ever to get their understanding of history, of politics, of current events, if they get that understanding at all, from textbooks, and certainly not from reading for pleasure and edification, but from screens of some sort. Cell phones, of course, TVs, laptops, tablets of various kinds, and so on. And they'll get that information and that understanding in the form of videos, documentaries, movies, TV shows. And so whoever controls that space, that medium, will very likely control the narratives from which younger generations learn about history and current events. I wrote an article very recently about documentary filmmaker Ken Burns, who is sometimes referred to as America's storyteller, because he has made literally dozens of documentary films and series about Americana, about inherently American themes and characters such as baseball, Thomas Jefferson, jazz, the Civil War. As America's storyteller, Ken Burns' decidedly progressive perspective on his subjects will be the ones that are absorbed as truth by today's youth and by future generations. That's why it's so critical that conservatives get in the game and start doing more to carve out a space for our narratives, the values and perspectives on history and current events that we want to pass down to younger viewers as the years and the decades go on. We can't afford to let that arena be dominated by the likes of documentary filmmakers like Ken Burns, much less radical propagandists like Michael Moore. And in fact, we are beginning to make some headway in that field, thanks to the extraordinary success of conservative author and filmmaker Dinesh D'Souza and his films like 2016, Obama's America, and America, Imagine the World Without Her, and more recently, standout films like What is a Woman, created by Matt Walsh and The Daily Wire. The outcome of the culture war, I would venture to say, will depend entirely on whose narrative prevails in the culture. The subversive propaganda of the neo-Marxists, or a more nuanced, complex narrative from the defenders of American exceptionalism and Western civilization, a narrative that does not gloss over our faults, but also does not fail to herald our achievements that the Marxists want to deny or even pervert into evils. To compete successfully, I believe conservatives need to throw more money behind talented content producers like writers and filmmakers, rather than wasting that money and pinning our hopes on politicians who will disappoint us or betray us in the end. Politics flows downstream from culture, as the saying goes, and so the culture is where we need to begin shaping the way people today and future generations will understand history and politics and current events. The left has always understood this, and that's why they have a half-century head start on us in terms of dominating and controlling the culture and influencing our youth. I raise this issue because my guest today at the Right Take Podcast is a filmmaker herself and a conservative who cares deeply about preserving the values and the legacy of Western civilization and countering the lies of our enemies, both external and internal, whose aim is to tear that civilization down. She's a good friend of mine, I'm honored to say, and I'm intimately familiar with her films. I've seen her at work. I've had discussions with her about these issues, and I believe passionately in supporting the work that she's doing and the goals that she is trying to achieve. So I'm going to bring her on in a moment and let her speak for herself about who she is, about her work, and about the concerns she has in terms of defending the West from its numerous threats. So please stay with us here at the intersection of politics and culture. You don't want to miss this interview. And don't forget to subscribe to The Right Take so that you don't miss any of the important conversations we're having here. And remember, if you like what you hear, please leave a review. It really helps. We'll be right back with my guest after this awesome musical interlude. Don't touch that dial. My guest today at the intersection of politics and culture is filmmaker Gloria Greenfield. Since founding Doc Emmett Productions in 2007, Gloria has been the driving creative force behind internationally acclaimed documentaries including The Case for Israel, Body and Soul, The State of the Jewish Nation, Unmasked Judeophobia, The Fight of Our Lives, and most recently, Civilization in the Danger Zone. And honestly, if our side had more culture creators like Gloria Greenfield, maybe our civilization wouldn't be in a danger zone. Gloria Greenfield, welcome to the Right Take podcast.
Oh, it's great being here. I always love talking with you.
Likewise, great having you. Gloria, how about if we begin with you giving us a little bit of backstory about yourself, about who you are, and maybe how you found yourself doing what you do?
Well, since I was in elementary school, actually, I was always interested in communicating and how we communicate. And so by the time I did my undergraduate work, I was involved in. I was a radio DJ. I was a news editor in the college paper. And then by the time I got to graduate school, I also added a book publisher there. So I've communicate, and also I did my undergraduate work in communication with a particular focus on rhetoric. So I've always recognized the importance of understanding the systems involved in communicating and understanding the process, that it's not a one-way experience. Communication can only happen effectively if the communication is intentional between the speaker and the listener. So by the time I went through various careers, which, when you hit your 70s, you've had the opportunity to experiment and gain experience through various roles and industries, etc. I always loved filmmaking, and I realized by 2006 that documentary filmmaking was a really effective way of communicating ideas and realities. And I had a wonderful opportunity to work with a documentary filmmaker on the first film, and I got hooked. It proved to be an incredibly important venue to work with. So I love film, but I'm not making film for the sake of making film. I see film as a very effective and important tool for helping people understand realities.
I'd say that's even more important than ever, actually, because as I mentioned in my opening comments before I brought you on, readership is in decline. I mean, reading of books is not how young people get their information about the world or their understanding of the world anymore, is it? It's they get it mostly through screens now, through cell phones and TVs and movies and documentaries. So I'd say the medium of film is more important than ever in terms of communicating what you want to communicate. Isn't that right?
I think so. And, sometimes people, and particularly, I mean, I know that storytelling is really, really important. But there are various ways of creating impactful documentary films. We're especially conservative filmmakers, and particularly conservative documentary filmmakers, are often challenged by others saying, well, if your film is only for the choir, if it's only preaching to the choir, et cetera, then it's not really impactful. It's a waste of time. And I want to challenge that, because that accusation is never given to progressives. Progressives are never they're never measured. Their work is never measured by whether they can successfully turn conservatives into progressives. And an additional way of looking at that is to denigrate what people refer to as preaching to the choir, is basically saying, you only have to go to church once in your life, or you only have to go to synagogue once in your life, and that's enough because you just need that message once. Well, no, that's not true. There are certain things that are necessary, like going to church or synagogue regularly, because it deepens our understanding of our faith. It deepens our understanding of our foundational texts. And I say that it is fine for conservative documentary filmmakers to make films that are going to bring additional clarity and additional ways of understanding the challenges that we face today.
Yeah, I think it helps conservatives I think it helps empower them to defend their values in ways that maybe they couldn't articulate before.
Yeah, I think so, and that's something I'm very conscious of when I make my films. Look, and particularly in today's climate, there's such polarization that to think that a conservative filmmaker is going to reach progressives or will be of interest to progressives, I think that's not very realistic. And I think that we need to put our energies into people who live more traditionally and people who are also open to understanding what is happening in the world, that they're not reading, they're not watching for the purpose of just defending their progressive views. But there are people who they're busy in their lives and they don't align one way or another, but they want to understand what's happening. They want to understand what's happening to their children's world. They want to understand what's happening to their adult lives. And that's who I'm interested in making films for.
Tell us a little bit about Doc Emmett Productions. What is that about, and what's your mission there?
Okay, so Doc Emmett, first, let me help people understand what the title refers to. So Doc obviously is abbreviation for documentary. Emmett is the Hebrew word for truth. So Doc Emmett Productions is about truth in film. So our films, our mission, Doc Emmett Productions' mission, is to produce and disseminate feature-length documentary films that strengthen freedom and liberty and Judeo-Christian values.
On the progressive side of filmmaking, the left, I think, fully understands the importance of documentaries that promote their worldview and their agenda. I always remind people that after his presidency ended, Barack Obama didn't just ride off into the sunset and settle into this role as an elder statesman. Instead, he went to Netflix to make this production deal with them for millions of dollars to produce progressive content because he understands that political change begins with cultural change. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And, for me, you know, making the film is stage one. The even more important stage is taking the film out on the road and engaging communities in conversations about the issues that are addressed in the film. And that takes us back to like why I'm working with film, because I think that film is an incredibly impactful way of engaging communities in these really important conversations that we need to have, and particularly conversations that we often don't have the opportunity to have publicly because of the bigotry against people who think conservatively. The demonization of our ideas and our ways of perceiving, and we need that. And so I love, I really love, talking to audiences in churches and synagogues, in community centers, at organizations. It gives people an opportunity to really flush out. And also, because documentary film can be very dense with information, it also helps people process what they've just seen. So I think that that's a really important step. It's not enough to just make a film. The film has to become a resource. The film has to become a tool that we use to help, I'll say, save the world.
Yes. Speaking of the importance of film and documentaries, why do you think moneyed conservatives have taken so long to realize the power of the culture and have been, and still are, really reluctant to throw their financial weight behind conservative filmmakers? I mean, if you're a progressive filmmaker, if you're Oprah Winfrey or one of the trained Marxists, as they call themselves, from Black Lives Matter, or if you're a Nicole Hannah-Jones from the 1619 Project, Hollywood and Netflix will throw production deals at you worth millions of dollars. Even basketball star LeBron James, who is a left-wing activist also, even he was able to put together a $400 million fund to produce social justice content that he says he hopes will move the needle of the culture. I mean, I get that filmmaking is a higher risk investment, but the left doesn't think twice about making that kind of investment. But conservatives seem really reluctant to. Do you think that's largely because of ignorance or just thinking in terms of financial conservatism? Why do you think conservatives with money have taken so long to get behind filmmakers?
Because I think that conservatives have, when they think about their activism, they think about politics or institutional building, but culture is not. I mean, it's getting better because of cultural critics like yourself. But and there's awareness now about the importance of addressing pop culture, and you've written brilliantly about that, by the way, about how we have to take pop culture seriously. We have to understand what it is, and then we also have to understand how we can use it for good. So I think that too many people on the right think of film as entertainment at best, and we just have to keep on talking about this: the importance of culture, the importance of building our cultural institutions. I mean, one example. It's not only, funding film, it's also creating and funding conservative film festivals, which is very important. It's very important. And so we have a history of there being some conservative film festivals. They last, maybe a few years, and then they're gone. And it's very hard. It's very hard to find the venues for conservative filmmakers, and we need to. I think that when you have film festivals, you're saying that there's a value to the films, right? So we need to do that. I mean, thank God, we have at a time um, when the big digital streaming platforms are really censoring conservative thinking films and particularly documentaries. Thank God we have Salem Now out there, because Salem Now which is part of the Salem Media Group. Um, you know, they were founded as a Christian institution, but on their digital streaming platform, Salem Now, they realized that it needed to be expanded from just Christian films to Christian and conservative films. So they're providing a venue for those of us who do conservative documentary films. But we also need the film festivals, and we also need a variety of um, digital streaming platforms so that we could reach wider and wider audiences.
Yes, great point. I know for a fact that your films and your website too have been targeted by censorship and deplatforming, which I suppose is a good sign on the one hand because it shows that the enemies of civilization consider you and your work a problem or an obstacle. But obviously, it's difficult and problematic for you. Could you mention an instance or two in which you or your work have been targeted in that way?
Yeah, sure. You know, we were canceled by um, a previous web host, a web developer. I didn't like, on our website, on docemmettproductions.com is our website. And you certainly know this because you're one of our regular writers for our deep dives into critical issues, which is an important part of the website. In addition to the films, it also it's an important complement to the films because it allows us on a monthly basis, feature really important articles by great journalists and scholars such as yourself. So this Knoxville-based, web developing firm decided that they didn't like the issues that our blogs were addressing, that our articles were addressing, so they canceled us. Just shut it down. And so the other thing that we recently have dealt with as censorship has gotten much more intense, is that digital distributor that has been representing, our films since 2014, rejected our latest film, Civilization in the Danger Zone. They have no problem, with progressive films and with like horror shows and stuff like that. But that's the reality today. The reality is that there are less and less options and will continue in that vein until the Republican and conservative world wakes up and realizes that culture is really important and we need to establish our own. Doesn't mean that we won't engage at all in other institutions that exist if they have the integrity to represent diversity of ideas. But we need to have our own. We can't rely on the integrity of progressives.
Let's talk a little bit specifically about some of your films. Document Productions has released 5 films so far. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, and the first 3 were focused on the Jewish state and the Jewish people, although I don't want to suggest that that's a narrow focus. But your first film was The Case for Israel, Democracy's Outpost, which presents the case for Israel's basic right to exist and to defend its
as a Jewish state, right?
Yes, and to defend its borders from enemies that are literally hell-bent on eradicating the Jews of Israel. Like all your films, it features this lineup of powerhouse commentators, in this case, people like Alan Dershowitz, Bibi Netanyahu, Carolyn Glick, and many more, who all very, very rationally but passionately and articulately defend Israel as the only island of liberal democracy in this sea of Arab authoritarianism. What was that experience like for you as your first film? And what did you learn from it that maybe you carried on to later films?
So it's interesting that you asked this question because, in fact, if one looks at, in a chronological order, the films that I've made, that I've produced and directed and written, one sees that it's a deeper unpacking or broadening of look as each film develops. So the first film was, as you said, The Case for Israel, Democracy's Outpost. And after the film came out, and I was traveling around the world with that film, talking with audiences, it became clear to me that people were looking at the animosity towards the Jewish state as a political perspective and didn't understand that there was Jew hatred that was embedded in there. And so I decided that it was important for the next film, which is titled Unmasked Judeophobia. It was important for that film to look at the resurgence of lethal Jew hatred in regions around the world, and that film came out in 2011, and also how the central engine of that Jew hatred was the jihadist movements. And in fact, that's still very much true today in throughout Europe. In this country, it's interesting because if I was looking at the resurgence of lethal Jew hatred in regions around the world, and in particularly in North America, it wouldn't be necessarily the jihadists or the radical Muslim communities. That would be one part of it, but we would have to look at, and we see some of that in the Squad, etc. But we would have to also look at the Jew hatred, the anti-Semitism that has been driven by radical blacks who have been very influenced by Farrakhan and by the progressive left movements. So that film was important. It was considered, very radical, and just the title itself of using the term Judeophobia as opposed to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was actually coined by a Jew hater, where the term Judeophobia was termed by one of the founding Zionist pioneers, Pinsker. The other thing is that, the radical Black community that is engaged in Jew hatred would use, particularly around that time, they would use the cover of, well, you can't call, and Farrakhan especially would use this, you can't call us anti-Semitic because we're Semites as well. So that was important, and it was like one of the early sort of reintroductions of the term Judeophobia. But after that film came out, then I realized, and I traveled with that film, I realized that the next film had to look at the 3,000-year history of the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, and the centrality of the land of Israel to Jewish identity. And that film was Body and Soul, The State of the Jewish Nation. That came out in 2014. After that film came out, it became clear to me that we had to go broader in our scope and not just look at the assault, the calls to destroy the Jewish state and the Jewish people, but it was really part of a war against Judeo-Christian values. Is a war against Jews and Christians. And so in 2018, we released my fourth film, The Fight of Our Lives, Defeating the Ideological War Against the West. And that also, in that film, in addition to dealing with cancel culture and the weaponization of identity, etc., it also spent time, really important time, on the importance for Jews and Christians to understand that we are facing the same enemies and that we need to come together and fight together.
And that's why you kind of broadened in your most recent films, The Fight of Our Lives and Civilization in the Danger Zone. That's why you kind of broadened your focus a little bit from Israel to Western civilization in the larger sense, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, because Western civilization is founded on the Hebrew Bible and the Judeo-Christian values that emanate from the Hebrew Bible. That gave us, that was behind in the United States. It was very much on the mind of the founding fathers. That's why there's such biblical, references. It's the Ten Commandments, which is very, very important for civilization. And, it was, as Ruth Weiss addresses in Civilization in the Danger Zone, the reason why the Ten Commandments is so important is because it tells us what not to do, what we shouldn't be doing. It recognizes how dangerous society can become, how bad individuals can be if they don't follow the Ten Commandments. That's why thou shalt not, murder, thou shalt respect, your mother and father, etc. That stuff is really, really important. And what's scary now is the demonization of Judeo-Christian values. and the decadence that we see emerging all around us.
Yeah, The Fight of Our Lives, that's actually from 2018. I can't believe it's that long ago, but that could not be more relevant today. Its subtitle is Defeating the Ideological War Against the West. How would you describe that ideology that's waging war against the West?
Well, it's become sharpened in the past few years, obviously, but even in 2018, we could see it. The war, the ideological war against the West, right in the front is the demonization and delegitimization of the values that that the West was built upon. The faith, family, as ideas. The ideology, the progressive ideology started. It demonized the family. It demonized the nation state. It demonized faith. The ideas that had been the seeds that had been planted by Marxist-Leninist ideology. It was like a long march through the institutions, and now it's at a very fast pace. So those ideas, it really is accelerating, and it's weaponizing. It's weaponizing the various segments of this ideology, whether it's communist Marxist-Leninist, or, if you want to call it Maoism, but, Mao is Marxist-Leninist. It's really the poison that's been penetrating our free societies. And that's why I made Civilization in the Danger Zone, because things have gotten so escalated since The Fight of Our Lives. And we're seeing how it's playing out, and we're seeing the mainstreaming. That's the thing. These ideas, these seeds of attacking and demonizing, delegitimizing our most important foundational blocks. They're mainstreamed now. They're being implemented. It used to be that it was just on the college campuses, but that's not the case anymore. I mean, when Gramsci, talked about the importance of penetrating, that he's an Italian anarchist, basically, how it was important to penetrate every industry, every institution of society. And now we see that that's been implemented. We see it in every industry. And we see it in particularly in big tech, the empowerment, the weaponization of big tech to put the final nails in the destruction of Western civilization. And I say that the Civilization in the Danger Zone is a very, very strong call to action.
Yeah, and both those films, they're such fantastic films, and in both you've got these amazing speakers, like some of which appear in both films. But this time in Civilization in the Danger Zone, you added some people like Rod Dreher, Dave Rubin, Christopher Rufo, Frank Gaffney, and lots more. Both those films identify, as you've been talking about, a whole raft of serious threats to the West today, both internal and external, like China. Is there one that stands out to you as more than any other, as the most imminent or most urgent danger?
It's a tough question, because one of the other purposes for Civilization in the Danger Zone was to help people see the connected dots. We have people out there who are and for very good reasons, focused on aspects of this assault on our civilization, and don't always have the opportunity to see how it's all connected. You know, it's not just the schools. Um, it's not just you know gender ideology. It's all of these very, very strong toxic movements that really are part of a central movement to destroy the West. Um, so we could look from a physical, I mean, I shouldn't say physical. I mean, from a military perspective, China is a huge threat. But I have to say that China can only be such a huge threat because of the toxicity in our culture. So I would say that, cancer used to be, decades ago, cancer used to be, you know, addressed by just going in and removing parts of a body, right? Without understanding that the cancer really, was a threat to the entire physical system. And I say that we could look at the cancer that has been growing, the toxicity that's been growing within, that's been penetrating Western civilization, and it's not gonna we're not gonna change things by only dealing with one aspect of it. It's not enough to deal with China. It's huge and important to deal with China, but it's not enough to just deal with China. It's not enough to just deal with the schools. It's not enough to, we could go issue by issue, and we have to look at things from a holistic perspective. And I look, some of the threats are more lethal in a shorter period of time than others. But, the threat is not, and I'll go out and get some people upset, but if people would look at reality instead of getting themselves so clogged up with what they're referring to as climate change, um, I think that we'd have a really good chance of turning things around.
Yes, I agree with you that it's all connected and that the external threats are not really so much the problem as the internal ones, because I'm reminded of Arnold Toynbee's observation that civilizations die from suicide, not from murder. So it begins with strengthening ourselves internally and dealing with the internal threats. I sometimes ask my guests this question, and I would love to get your take on it. Above and beyond this ideological war in which we are embroiled, do you think that the real heart of this fight is spiritual? In other words, are we really ultimately engaged in spiritual warfare here?
Oh, absolutely. You've written a really important article on the sort of resurgence of paganism and Satanism. This is a spiritual war. It's not. There are. I guess what I would say is that sort of the political warfare, like the Marxist-Leninism stuff, is a tool. It's a weapon in the toolbox of this spiritual war. There is real evil in the world, and some of that evil gets, manifests as the Chinese Communist Party. Some of it gets manifest by the greed in the medical world that is willing to experiment and destroy children's bodies for capital gain. I mean, we could just go on, but at the center of it It's the war of evil against the good.
I'm surprised sometimes when I have guests on who openly express a kind of a pessimism about the future of the West. And I know there are thinkers like Rod Dreher, whom I admire greatly, who are beginning to think that the West is in some ways its own worst enemy, and that it may even have warped into something that might not even be worth saving. Are you optimistic that this fight of our lives is a fight that we can win?
Look, I think that one of the reasons why faith is so important is because we are strengthened when we acknowledge that we don't have to do this alone, and that God is part of this, part of the solution. God really, part of the problem, part of the weakening of the West has been the secularization of the West. So what I remind myself almost every morning is that whether we are pessimistic or not, we have to maintain and nurture our faith, and we have to fight without thinking about, are we going to win or are we going to lose? We must fight for what is good. We cannot just stand by and watch other people do it. As individuals, if we're not in the fight, then we become part of what's evil. So that's not to say that there aren't times when I feel overwhelmed, but my goal is to minimize the time that I feel overwhelmed and maximize the time that I acknowledge God's presence in my life and as a strengthening of my life.
Well said. I think we have to ground ourselves in our faith first and proceed outward from there. I know that you just had the New York theatrical premiere of Civilization in the Danger Zone a few weeks ago. How did that go, and how was it received? How has it been received as you've shown it around in different film festivals? And where does it go from there? In other words, where and when can people see it?
Oh, well, people can see it now. First of all, it's gotten incredible response. Audiences really, really love it. And I've had people also in the audience who were crying, not out of fear, but because they were so relieved that they felt less alone, less isolated, and they also felt that the film helped them understand the connections, right? And I've had incredible responses, in the UK, throughout the United States, and gotten great response in Canada. So I'm proud. I mean, I have this in my as a filmmaker. I feel that I have a very spiritual relationship in the work that I do. I feel that I'm doing the mission that I'm meant to do, and I appreciate the gifts I get from God that help me make these films. But people can watch the film on via streaming at salemnow.com. They can purchase DVDs, and I'm seeing more and more people realizing the importance of having DVDs, particularly at this time of censorship. That if a film is important, you have to have it because it's not you can't take for granted if it's not a woke film that it's going to be available via streaming. But thank God for salemnow.com. And so you could go to their site and you can rent it or you can buy it. Or you can get the DVDs at docemmettproductions.com in the shop we have online. Oh, and you could even buy the DVDs at salemnow.com.
Well, I completely agree with you about the importance of having the physical thing itself. I say the same things to people about books. That you no longer can trust that your e-reader or your Kindle will allow you to have the book that you thought you owned if it's not woke enough. It's important to have the actual physical book for the future, or in your case, the physical DVD. I know that right now you are still kind of deeply immersed in promoting Civilization in the Danger Zone, but can I ask you if you have an idea already for your next film, or do you not want to jinx it?
It's not a matter of jinxing it. It's a matter of, usually it's during the second year of doing screenings with the film that I'm positive what the next film will be. And because what I base it on is in those conversations with the audiences, in addition to what I see coming down the pike. That's where I see like what the need is. Like what is it? What aspect of what we're dealing with do we need to focus in on? So I'm not going to answer that, because the times in the past when I have answered it, it's always changed. But I think that what I find to be important, the things that I find important, that's not going to change.
Is your website docemmettproductions.com? Is that the best place for people to keep up with what you're doing, or do you have a social media presence also that you want to share?
Yeah, we're developing our, we're renovating our, Instagram, but the website, and we also, post some stuff on Facebook, but I think the website is really rich. And the other thing is that, people can subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. You just sign up so that every month you get the articles that are coming out, as well as announcements about where screenings will be. And also that's where we announce the new film. So just go to docemmettproductions.com and send a note via the website that you want to be on the mailing list, and you'll be up to date on everything. And in particular, you'll get those great deep dives into critical issues.
Listeners, I cannot recommend highly enough that you get hold of or stream Gloria's documentaries, perhaps especially your most recent one, Civilization in the Danger Zone, and watch them with friends and family too. Maybe even gather enough people to put on a group screening at your home, because the work that she's doing and the message that she's trying to get out there is a vital one for our civilization's survival, and that is no hyperbole. Gloria Greenfield, thank you for giving us your time and insights today at the Right Take Podcast, and please keep up your courageous work.
Thank you, and you do the same.
Listeners, thanks for joining us. Just another reminder to subscribe to the Right Take Podcast so you don't miss any of these important conversations we're having here. And if you like what you hear, please leave a review. Thanks, and see you next time. The Right Take with Mark Tapson is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.